everyone, and welcome to LitFest 2021 online. Thank you for joining us this evening. We are joined tonight by author Camron Wright. Camron has master's degrees in writing and public relations and is the author of several award-winning novels, including Letters for Emily, The Rent Collector, and The Orphan Keeper. His most recent book, In Times of Rain and War, came out earlier this year. So Camron, thank you very much for joining us for LitFest this year.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay. We are going to listen to what you have to say about your practical observations on the career of writing. And we're going to listen to your insight for a little while, and then we're going to do some Q&A at the end. So take it away.
Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, I was really excited when I was asked to talk about writing and sort of my journey into writing, because usually I'm talking about one of my books, and I actually really love to talk about writing. I find it intriguing and always happy to chat about it. I thought maybe what would make sense is to sort of give a little bit of context to my journey in writing, kind of how I started, because it's maybe a little different path than most writers. I kind of fell into the craft of writing as a midlife crisis. And I have to be careful when I say that because, you know, there's no girlfriend, no sports car. It was just a professional midlife crisis, if we'll call it that. We had some retail stores, bridal stores, actually, bridal as in weddings, not horses. I have to clarify that. It was always actually a little bit embarrassing for a guy to admit, you know, that we were in the bridal business. I remember I would complain about it, right? And so I ran into a guy one time, and we were chatting, and I'm sort of lamenting this, and he looked at me and he said, "Camron, you have no idea. I own lingerie stores." And so I promised I wouldn't complain after that. But yeah, we were in the bridal business. We sold the stores, and I thought, well, you know, great. I'll go get a job. I'll go start another business, whatever. And I struggled. It was a time in my life where I was really kind of struggling to know what to do professionally. I'm kind of a personality. I need to wake up in the morning and feel like I'm, you know, doing something that's making a difference. And I was just not finding that at these various places I was trying. And it was kind of amidst all of this, my wife was in a couple of book clubs. She would bring the books home. I'd pick them up and thumb through them. Sometimes I'd get sucked in. I'd read the whole book. Other times I'd just, you know, read a chapter or two. But I remember picking up a book one time that she brought home and kind of scanning it and then telling her, I could write this stuff. And I have no idea where that came from, why I thought I could, but you know, that's what I told her. And so then, you know, life went on. I continued to try different things, and maybe, I don't know, a handful of months later, I was doing, just to keep busy, I was doing some artwork that was in an art gallery, and so I was out looking for some exotic wood to make frames for this artwork, and so I was in this exotic wood store. Yes, there is such a place. It was kind of this big warehouse. And this old man was taking me around showing me these various kinds of wood. And when I say exotic wood, I'm talking, you know, there's like purple wood and black wood and wood from Africa, Indonesia, all across the world. And he's taking me around, and we came to a stack of wood, and I said, "What's this?" And he said, "Well, that's actually not exotic at all. It's just maple." He said, there's a demand, and so we carry it, but, you know, it's just really just plain maple. But next to it, there was a stack of wood that had all these cool black lines through it. It was just beautiful. And I said, "Oh, well, what's this?" And he kind of got a gleam in his eye, and he kind of, you know, said, "Oh, I'm glad you asked." And then he proceeds to tell me that this is exactly the same type of wood. It's maple. But he said there's a beetle that will eat into the maple tree. And he said if the tree's strong enough and if it survives, then these burrows grow into these, you know, black lines, which then make the wood rare and valuable. And he's telling me this, and I'm thinking, that's like such a cool analogy on life, right? I mean, if we can withstand the adversity, then the adversity actually makes us, you know, more rare, more beautiful than had we not had the adversity. And so I thought, you know what, I'm going to use that somewhere. I have no idea where, but I went home that night with the intention of just writing down this lesson that this old man had taught me. And again, this is sort of in the midst of what am I going to do with my life? And I could write this stuff. And so I sat down to really just write out this lesson. And before I knew it, I thought, you know what, this is a pretty good chapter for a book. And I'm sort of a guy, though, I can't spell a word if it has more than 3 letters in it. Again, wasn't an English major, and English teachers still scare me. But so I thought, well, if I'm going to try something as crazy as that, I probably need to tell my wife, what's going on, because it'll take some time. I'll be locked in my office on the computer. And so that night I kind of hummed and hawed and finally blurted out, I'm thinking of writing a book. And she was just silent, staring at me. I'm thinking, oh, great, And finally she said, you know what? I think you could write a great book. And so it was really all the encouragement I needed. For the next few weeks, I just sort of banged out having no idea what I was doing, kind of banged out this first manuscript. And as I finished it, I had the idea for Letters for Emily, which was my first published book. And even really before I'd written a sentence of Letters for Emily, I knew that it would be a better first book to come out with. And so I'm sure my wife thought I was just completely nuts because, not only I'm going to write a book, but then I finish it and I say, now I'm going to write another book, But that's what I did. And so I wrote Letters for Emily. And then after it was finished, I thought, well, what do I do with it? I don't know how to get a book published. I don't know anybody in the publishing industry. I had no idea what to do. So I started to do some research, and I came across an article that explained that you can't send your book to a publishing house. They won't look at it. You have to have an agent. And you can't even send your book to an agent. You have to reduce your book down to a one-page query letter, and that's what you send to the agent, hoping that they'll request your book. And in one of these articles I'm reading, it said that the average New York agency receives about 10,000 to 25,000 query letters a year. Of those, let's take the low number. Of those 10,000 query letters, they'll request about 100 manuscripts. Of those 100 manuscripts, they'll take on 10 new clients. So, you don't have to be a brain surgeon to do the math, right? I read that and I start lamenting to my wife. And in fact, my exact words, I said, you know what? I'm screwed. I'm never getting published. And she thought for a minute. She said, wait, I want to make sure I understand what you're talking about. And so we kind of went through the numbers again. And then she said, now, so let me get this straight. If you don't write the book and you don't publish it, then what are your chances of getting published? I'm like, yeah, dang it. I hate it when she's right. And so, but that said, those are the odds really of jumping into the publishing industry and deciding that you want to try and publish a book. Extremely difficult. So I did what most writers would do. I picked a bunch of agents, I sent off the query letter, and this is pre-internet. And so you're mailing all of these, and then you're waiting anywhere from 6 to 8 weeks if you get a response at all. Most of the time they simply just don't respond. The responses I do get back, they're just generated form letters. Yeah, we're not interested. Well, I'm kind of an impatient guy, and I thought, yeah, this probably isn't the way to do it. And so I started to look around at what a couple of local authors had done, namely Richard Paul Evans, James Pratt was another one. They had the same situation. They self-published their books, proved that they would sell, and then they were able to garner the interest of a publisher. And so I thought, hey, I'm a business guy. I can do that. So in doing my research, I kind of figured out that I need to sell about 10,000 copies in about 6 months to really get the attention of anybody who would matter. And so kind of being the overachiever that I am, I ordered 15,000 copies of my book. And I remember the day that the semi arrived with books to unload. We just moved into a new home. We had a 3-car garage. And he had a forklift, and he's, I'm here to deliver books. Oh, great. And so he starts to put pallet after pallet of these books into our garage. By the time he finished, he'd filled up 2.5 bays. So we could squeeze 1 car into the garage. And I was sick to my stomach. I thought, you moron, what did you do? And it's not a route I would recommend, a path for most writers. If you do, you'll end up with really a garage full of books. But in my case, things just started to work out. I'm working my tail off, trying to do any and everything I can to get the book out there. But that said, luck, whatever happened. And I was able, for example, to get a copy to a local guy who writes for the newspaper, wrote an article on it. He loved the book. I was able to get a copy to one of the radio station personalities, the largest radio station in the state, and she began to talk about it, and things just started to happen, and the book started to sell, and um, and so within a couple of months, actually, within about 2 months, I'd sold about 12,000 copies. So I'd already hit my goal. And I had people saying, you know what, don't wait. You don't wait 6 months. You need to go out and try and get an agent now. And so I had the sales from the distributor. I had this sort of the sales report validating that we had indeed sold that many books. I had by then a couple of New York Times best-selling authors who'd given me blurbs for the book. I remember going down to Walden Book, was still in business. And I went down to the Walden Book. I'd kind of become friends with the manager there, and they'd been selling the book like crazy. He had all of his salespeople would hand sell the book to anybody who walked in. And so I walked in, and I said, hey, George, could you give me something? I'm going to try and get an agent. Can you give me a letter or something that says the book's been selling well? And he said, yeah, sure, not a problem. And so we sat down, he typed at the computer a minute, and then he said, whoa, that's interesting. And I said, what's that? And he said, well, you're out selling the Oprah pick 5-1. And I'm like, okay. Now I knew that it was only because they were hand selling it to everybody. The only store in the world, right, that was selling that many copies. But that said, I said, hey, can you put that in a letter? He said, yeah, sure, absolutely. And so I had all of these things going for the book. And I thought, you know what? I'm going to have my pick of agents. Any agent I want is going to want to pick up this book. So I chose 10 agents, and I sent this letter off again with all of this supporting material to these 10 agents. To give you an idea of just how difficult the industry is, 8 out of 10 didn't even respond. They didn't bother to answer. Now, the plus side is that 2 out of 10 did respond. And so I had a couple of agents who were interested, and then I had a third agent approach me who'd heard about the book through somebody else. And so I was in the enviable position of having 3 agents who wanted to represent the book. And so I picked the agent I thought would do the best job. Before I knew it, the book had gone to auction. All of the big publishing houses in New York were bidding on the book. And it was just this really surreal pinch me moment of, is this really happening? Like, this is crazy. Ultimately, Simon & Schuster purchased North American rights, and then it was translated and published in a dozen countries around the world. And it was just it was amazing. And I was scared to death that people were going to find out that I really wasn't a writer. I was kind of, hacking my way through this. And so really, if there's one thing you take away from listening to my remarks today, as writers, as authors, I hope it's that, you know what, if Camron can do it, anybody can do it. And so, yeah, that's how really I kind of broke into the business and the publishing industry. Maybe now I want to kind of transition into sort of lessons that I've learned along the way, sort of things that I can maybe help others look for or at least think about. One of the things that I would suggest to new writers is ignore the crowd and follow your instincts. And what do I mean by that? Well, in the publishing industry, writers tend to follow a trend. What's trendy? What's selling right now? After Twilight, everybody was writing vampire stories, right? That's all that anybody was submitting. And really, I think you're doing it then for the wrong reasons. You're sort of chasing it rather than worrying about your story and creating something that is special, if you will. There's an old song by Martina McBride, and she sings, "Don't give them what they think they want because they don't have a clue." And that's absolutely true. I remember my agent telling me at the time that publishing houses have no idea what books are going to sell and what books won't sell. And she said, that's what makes this business so fun and so frustrating all at the same time. Let me give you another example of kind of this concept. There were 2 guys who had an idea for a book, and they thought it would take them 3 months to get an agent and a publisher. 3 years later, they were still pitching their book. They were told that their material was weak, there would be no demand. They finally convinced a small publishing house in Florida to take a chance. And the 2 men were Mark Hansen and Jack Canfield, and their book, Chicken Soup for the Soul, arguably one of the most successful publishing phenomenon of our time. I mean, you name it now, they have Chicken Soup for, whatever. I was looking up, they have chicken soup for the NASCAR soul. My personal favorite, chicken soup for the prisoner's soul. You know that they're like really reaching when they start to pick some of these topics, but they have sold millions upon millions upon millions of copies. So despite everyone telling them otherwise, these guys followed their instinct, they followed their gut, and they turned it into success. I think maybe another bit of information might be to be a storyteller first and a writer second. What do I mean by that? Well, sometimes as writers, we tend to get caught up in sort of the technical details, be it the grammar or the research or what's the cover going to look like and what can I do marketing wise. I would contend that really we need to worry about plot, pacing, characters, what's your hero's journey? How does the protagonist change? What makes the reader at 2 o'clock in the morning turn page after page when they have to go to work the next day? I'll tell you, it's not your punctuation, right? I knew I was getting close with Letters for Emily, my first book, when I got notes back from the editor, and she said, you're getting better as you go along. She said, as I got near the end of the story, there were fewer mistakes. I'm telling you, there were not fewer mistakes. There were just as many mistakes, but she was getting into the story, and so she was overlooking them. And that's kind of what you want to do. You need to grab them with the story. So next bit of advice, I would say, fix your sloppy grammar. Now you're going to say, wait, I thought you just said, yeah, I did. While plot and story elements are significantly more important, if your work is full of grammatical errors, I'm telling you, you don't stand a chance. I'll give you an example. I had a writer who had printed some copies of his book, kind of self-published with a few copies, and he'd hoped to like do what I had done and get it published nationally. And so he gave me a copy, asked me if I would read through it. It was so full of grammatical errors that I could never get into the story. There was one that I've always remembered. It was my favorite. He said, I'm reading along and I come to the line, taking a breath, he exhaled. And I remember stopping and actually trying that, taking a breath, he exhaled. Like, how is that possible? I mean, it's not. I mean, clearly what he meant was, he took a breath and then he exhaled, or, whatever iteration of that, but he, not taking a breath, he exhaled. So you've just got to watch for things like that and not have a story full of those. Now, I'm not very good at picking up. I'm not a grammarian. I don't oftentimes know exactly where the comma goes. And so what do? Well, you get help. That's why God invented editors, right? So use family, friends, hire an editor, whatever you have to do. It doesn't mean you have to follow all of their recommendations because everything they say isn't going to be true. My favorite cartoon is one that ran, I think it was in the New Yorker. The editor is sitting in front of the desk. I'm sorry, the writer's in front of the desk, the editor's behind the desk, and the editor is saying to the writer, so, Mr. Dickens, was it the best of times or was it the worst of times? It could scarcely have been both. And that's very true, right? Very true. Editors are good at editing. They're not always as helpful on the creative side. And so it's up to you to sort of really decide what to change and what not to change. But they are excellent and they will help you, correct a ton of mistakes that would otherwise really bring your work down. I think another thing you have to do is you need to sort of mix your talent with tenacity. And I want to talk about talent for a minute. So you need sort of a talent, I think, to be successful in the business. But you also need work. It's kind of like they balance each other. I don't sit down and just sort of spew out amazing prose. It just doesn't work that way. Perhaps some of you do, some writers do, I don't. Sometimes I will write all day long. I'll look at what I've written at the end of the day and it's all crap, right? And I have to start over the next day. So I may not be sort of like a Shakespeare in writing talent, but I have a different talent. And I coined it this way. My talent is not in writing well, but knowing when I've written poorly. I can read something I've written and I know if it's good or not. And most of the time it's not, and I have to rework and rework and rework until finally I start to mold it into something that's passable, that's good, that's interesting. And I think that's really key for most writers. I mean, unless you're just a writing genius, and if you are, God bless you, but most writers aren't, and it just takes a lot of work. There was an author at a writing conference once who said he kind of reduced success to two words. He said two words are butt, and chair. He explained that you need to put your butt in your chair for so many hours a day. And if you do that long enough, then you'll be able to finish your book. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. I quoted Martina McBride earlier, so for the sake of equal time, here's a quote from Bare Naked Ladies. They sing, "You got to kick at the darkness till it bleeds daylight." And I just think there's just a lot of wisdom in that. Um, here's a personal example. Um, so when I'm writing a story, oftentimes I'll write down as I go words that I know I'm overusing, or phrases that I'm overusing, or anything that's questionable. I'm worried about really just getting the story down. And so I'm again focusing on pacing and plot, ignoring the word level stuff. Because my brain can only focus on one thing at a time. Well, at the end, I will go back and I will do a very deep word level edit on the manuscript I've written. And so I'll pick usually 5 or 6 best-selling books. I'll get them electronically because I can search words on those and I can see, okay, I've used the word, pick whatever word, beautiful, 27 times. And then I can go see how many times they've used it. And I can see, wow, I'm really overusing this word. And it might not just be a word, it may be a phrase, it may be a mannerism, it may be whatever. Well, in doing that for in times of rain and war, I was working on that word level edit. It took almost 2 months for just that one word level edit. And I know authors who can write a whole book in 2 months, right? I can't. But again, for those of us who maybe aren't as blessed on the talent side, you can make up for it if you're willing to put in the work. Another bit of advice. I think you need to stay very curious as a writer. And what does that mean? Well, people will ask me, what's the hardest thing about writing? And I will sort of facetiously say, well, putting all the words together, right? And it sounds like a quip, but there's actually a lot of truth to it. As writers, our job is to sort of select the words in the most effective order that really explain or describe or get across the point we're trying to get across. And that's what really makes writing so fun and so amazing, because there's 1,000 or even 1,000,000 ways that you can describe something. Let's look at an example. So say I ask you, describe peaches. Describe, what a peach is, what a peach tastes like. How would you do that? We can describe the color, we can describe the smell, the texture, the taste, how it feels in your hand. There's just so many different ways to handle it. Well, I was reading, I love Anthony Doerr. I think his descriptions are just amazing. I'm reading All the Light We Cannot See, and the main character in that, Marie LeBlanc, is a blind girl, and she finds a can of peaches, and she opens them and she tastes a peach for the first time. And in his brilliance, Anthony Doerr keeps it really simple, or she, the character, whoever is speaking, she describes peaches as wedges of wet sunlight. And I find that just brilliant. I just think that's an amazing way to describe peaches. That's what you want your writing to be. You want your writing to be wedges of wet sunlight. So how do we put those phrases together? Well, just again, it takes a lot of work. I want to talk sort of about the word level again, because that's maybe kind of what I've been focused on most recently. If you just pick any particular word in your writing, I think words have kind of 3 obvious traits. The first trait that a word has might be its meaning, right? That's kind of stating the obvious, right? But words convey something. If I say peach, you kind of know what that means, or desk, or car, or whatever. Well, words are also visual, and they have a look to them and a feel to them. And that's not really important in radio or audiobook, but people are reading your book and they are reading the words. And so there is something to the visual aspects of the word. Well, words also have sound, right? I'm again stating the obvious, but along with sound, words have sort of a rhythm. And currently that's a big focus for me. There are times I would contend that a word's rhythm is more important than its meaning. You might say, well, how can you say that? Well, here's a crude and terrible example, but we could say, Sally sells seashells by the seashore, or I could say, Sally markets her seashells from the beach. Now, those technically say the same thing, but they have a completely different rhythm to them. So I think in your phrasing, you want to use words that convey meaning. Sure, that's obvious. But I think more important is the words need to be noticed, they need to be remembered, and that happens with rhythm. There are countless times where in a sentence, I've changed things around because I need maybe a 2-syllable word instead of a 3 or 4-syllable word, or the other way around, or I just want it to flow better with the words that are beside it in the sentence. There are times where there will be several words, the thesaurus is easy to look in, and there are several words that mean the same thing, but there's one that's just going to sing a little better than the rest, if you will. So how do you start to grasp this? How do you start to hear rhythm? Well, I think the key is really starting with poetry. I'm not really kind of a poet, but I am recognizing the importance of reading poetry, of trying to understand poetry, of kind of using those tricks in poetry to help my writing be better. There's a scene in a movie Contact, if you've seen that, where Jodie Foster, she's sent out into space and she's seeing the majesty of galaxies and planets and other worlds. And she's just speechless. She doesn't know what to say. And she keeps mumbling, there are no words, there are no words. And then she finally says, they should have sent a poet. And I just think that's brilliant writing. I think that's just a great insight. So, where do you start? Well, a couple of recommendations. The Poet Handbook by Mary Oliver is great. She's also got a book called Rules for the Dance. That's excellent. There's, and I'm going to read, this is, let's see, Secret Formulas of the Wizard of Ads. This is one of my favorite books on writing. It's actually not a book on writing at all, right? It's a book on advertising. I was reading it for some client work I was doing, and as I'm reading it, every page is a book about writing. Now, it's about advertising, but insert writing for advertising, and you'll see what I mean. I just love this book. Roy Williams is the author, just brilliant, the points that he makes. And he's got a sort of this dissertation on poetry, and I think it sort of sums up what I've been trying to say. So this is just a poem by Edwin Arlington Robinson, and it's called Richard Cory. Let me just read this real quick and then we'll talk about it. Whenever Richard Cory went downtown, we people on the pavement looked at him. He was a gentleman from sole to crown, clean-favored and imperially slim. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked. But still, he fluttered pulses when he said, "Good morning," and he glittered when he walked. And he was rich, yes, richer than a king, and admirably schooled in every grace. In short, we thought that he was everything to make us wish that we were in his place. So on we worked and waited for the light, and went without the meat and cursed the bread. And Richard Cory, one calm summer night, went home and put a bullet through his head. Now, I love this on several levels. One, the surprise ending is fabulous. If you can do that in your writing, that's amazing. But you look at the phrasing here, and these are things that Roy Williams points out. But he has phrases like imperially slim and we people on the pavement. I mean, who would describe people that way? Well, when you hear descriptions that are kind of turned on their edge a little bit like that, your ears perk up and you listen. And I think that's sort of maybe the wisdom in trying to incorporate what we learn from poetry into our writing, is it makes our writing more interesting, more unusual. I could say to you, let's see, you should pick your words wisely. Or I could say, pick your words wisely, you should. What they did with Yoda and his dialogue is pure brilliance. Same exact principles here. They switch things around so it sounds different. Our ears perk up, we listen, it's interesting. Mark Twain offers a great example. I was reading The Ghost Story, which he wrote, and I'm reading along and I come to the sentence that says, I waited, listened, waited. And my first thought was, wait, there's a mistake in there. There's no conjunction. Shouldn't it say, I waited, listened, and waited? And then I'm thinking, you used waited twice. Wouldn't I waited, watched, and listened be better? No, it wouldn't be better. He was perfect. He did a great job. Because again, it caught my attention. It sounds just different, slightly different. I've copied him. I use that all the time now. In fact, an editor will say, yeah, you forgot the conjunction. No, actually, I didn't. Let me show you Mark Twain. They go, oh, yeah, okay, that's fine. And so again, you want to watch for those types of things in stories that you read. Begin to understand sort of the beauty, the poetry of words. Okay, let's move on to sort of style questions. I would consider my style to be a very simple writing style. So I don't use a lot of, really crazy words. On occasion, maybe if one fits, but typically it's a simpler style. Well, is that good or bad? Hemingway and Faulkner used to fight about this, and I really kind of find it hysterical. If they had social media back then, it would have been ugly, right? It would have been all over. But Faulkner, one time of Hemingway, he said, Ernest Hemingway has no courage. I mean, that's brutal, right? He has never crawled out on a limb. He has never been known to use a word that might cause the reader to check with the dictionary to see if it's properly used. Okay, does he have a point? I mean, maybe. Should we as writers be using more sophisticated words? I mean, possibly. There's nothing wrong with that. So later, Hemingway responded to Faulkner. He said, poor Faulkner, does he really think big emotions come from big words? He thinks I don't know the $10 words. I know them all right, but there are older and simpler and better words, and those are the ones that I use. You got to love, both sides really have a point. And who's right? Well, I think it depends. I mean, if your talent is using big scholarly words in an amazing way that will captivate your readers, great. Power off, power to you. But if you're like me, then I really sort of tend to lean towards Hemingway and look for the simpler words. What resources? Well, from a thesaurus point of view, the Synonym Finder is my favorite. Rodale's Synonym Finder, I think it's fabulous. I'll often use online, there's the freedictionary.com has a words that start with feature. And so you can type in words that start with R, and it gives you a list of every word that starts with R, because there's sometimes in sort of the rhythm of the sound, I know what meaning I want from a word, but it would be really cool if I could find a word with that meaning that starts with R. And so I'll go to that resource, and that's very helpful. And there are others, but those are some that I use. Let's switch gears and talk a minute about rejection. And that's a topic that's really hard for some writers. And there's sort of two levels of rejection. If you're trying to get published, there's sort of the agent printing house rejection. And then there's also sort of the reader level rejection. If you send your work out to somebody and they respond in a negative way, that's sort of rejection that we have to deal with. And so I want to kind of address how to work with that. Because I know a couple of writers who they'll go online and they'll start to read reviews and they'll read negative reviews, and it destroys them. They are useless for a day or two. It's just so debilitating for them. And I don't have that issue, but I find it interesting that some do. And I think we just need to take a fresh look at rejection and really kind of turn it around for our benefit, because really the majority of the time, it's not us. It's not us. Let me give you an example. There was a writer, his name was Chuck Ross. He describes an experiment that he conducted. He took the book Steps by Jerzy Kosinski, and this was a book that was not only a National Book Award winner, it had already sold 400,000 copies in paperback. So he typed it into manuscript form. I just love that he did this. And he submitted it to both publishing houses and to agents. Random House, the original publisher, rejected it, as did Houghton Mifflin, Doubleday, Harcourt, Brace, all huge New York houses who had all published previous work by Kosinski. There were 10 other leading publishers who rejected the work, as did 26 literary agents. Only Houghton Mifflin commented, "The style reminds the reader of Kosinski, though this new author is not in his league." So yeah, most of the time, if you send something off to an agent and you get a rejection letter back, most likely they didn't even read your work. It sat on a pile. They just don't have time. There's so much stuff. I told you, 10,000 to 25,000 query letters a year. They can't read them all. With The Rent Collector, and The Rent Collector, of all my books, it's the book that has sold the most copies and done extremely well. I had a New York agent tell me that no one would ever pick it up because it didn't have an American character in it. And she wasn't the only rejection letter I got for the book. I have a stack of rejection letters for The Rent Collector. you have to learn that sometimes the rejection's valid, and if it is, you need to learn from it. In my case, I had to stop and say, well, should I add an American character? Now, it took me about 2 seconds to say nonsense. No, books like The Little Chinese Seamstress, A Kite Runner, other books like that are kind of dropping into my head that I'm thinking, well, I don't think they had an American character. And so it didn't take me long to really write that off as a crazy comment. And again, that's your job as the writer. I was sort of enthralled with the notion of a story set in a Cambodian garbage dump, and I could just sort of feel that was a good idea. I just needed to build a cool story around that. That's kind of the passion that you need behind your work and that you need to feel about your work. I think the key is really sort of knowing when somebody has a credible, comment and when they don't. And I don't have a good way to tell you to do that. That's sort of innate, comes from your gut. But anyway, you just have to work towards that. Also, too, it depends on how you look at a negative review. I'll read a negative review, and I kind of look at that and I say, isn't that cool? Like, that's amazing. That person's read my book, right? Now, they may not have liked it. I don't care. They took the time to read my book. And so there are people out there who are reading something that I've written. That's not depressing. That's amazing, because there are also a lot of people who read the book and absolutely love it. And so really, if you just look at the rejection differently, I think that it really helps as writers. Let me kind of transition into sort of dealing with doubt. How do we do that? I can walk into a bookstore tonight and I'll look around and there's hundreds of books, hundreds of new books every month. And it will cause me to think, you know what, how can I compete? I mean, there is so many great books that are being written, that are being published. How can I possibly compete? And sometimes it is sort of a downer and it is sort of this, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? Well, what do you do with that? Well, you take those feelings and you need to channel that into your story. Every character in every story is going to go through some, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? How am I going to get through? What in the world's going to happen? Those are the feelings that you want to try and bring out in your characters. And so use those feelings when you have them. Write those feelings into your book. If you think I can never make it, that's the time you ought to be at the keyboard banging away the most, not, oh my gosh, I'm not going to do it anymore. So anyway, keep that in mind. Let's see, let me see what other highlights here. There are times that writers there are a lot of things that go into a successful story. There's the story, clearly. There are other things, like I say, you need to get an agent, you need a publisher, there's marketing, the book has to be marketed. There are times where, and in today's world, you can self-publish a book, you can do a lot of those things on your own. And there are times where authors, I find, get caught up in those other things. And really, they need to spend more time focusing on their story. I repeat over and over to people, it's always about the story. Everything you do has to improve that story and make the story better. All the best marketing in the world is not going to help a poorly written story. I had a friend who used to say, he would say, if it smells like poop and it looks like poop, you can only call it a Snickers bar for so long. I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. So your effort always needs to be, how can I make this story better? Once you can't do any more with the story, then you start to think about, marketing and other things. But really focus on the story. There are so many writers who send the story out too soon. Because they're so anxious, and I get that. I'm very impatient. I completely understand that mentality, but in most cases, it's actually a mistake. It's detrimental. You're better off to take a few extra months, a year or two, if that's what it takes, whatever it takes, to get that story to be the page turner that I talked about, that keeps people reading till 2 in the morning. All right, let's see, we're getting.
We can move on to some questions if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. You know what? Let me end with one point, and then let's go to questions.
Okay.
And that point would be really find your own path. And a lot of writers, the path that they view getting published as the goal. And I think that's a misguided goal. Let me give you an example. So my grandfather wrote poetry his entire life and stories, and he was never published. Before he passed away, he compiled those into a big, thick book that he passed out to the children and the grandchildren. And I remember when he gave it to us, I thought, oh, that, nice, Grandpa, thank you. And I put it up on the shelf, right? And I didn't worry too much about it. Well, later in reading that book, um, I realized, because my grandfather, he was an amazing man. For 85 years, he was this amazing person. The last 5 years of his life, he kind of turned into this ornery, mean, contemptible old man. And after he passed away, that's all anybody remembered. That's all they talked about. And it was in reading his poetry, his words, that I thought, and why are we talking about him when he wasn't himself, instead of the 85 years when he was this amazing person? And I said, hey, that's a great idea for a book. And that indeed was the inspiration for Letters for Emily. And so, yeah, my grandfather was never published, but he had a profound effect on me, on other family members. And so I think, if you love to write, don't let your focus be on, oh my gosh, if I'm published, I'll be successful. If I'm not published, I won't. That's ridiculous. That's absolutely ridiculous. Right for, Alice Sebold, when she wrote The Lovely Bones, she kept a sticky note on her computer and it read, for those five. And what does that mean? Well, she expected 5 people to read her manuscript. And she wrote it anyway. I love that. And so, keep that in mind, keep that attitude. And if you do, I think you'll find, you'll approach your writing in a completely different light. And it will indeed be helpful. So yeah, with that, let's see what questions people may have.
Okay, so I know that a few of your books are based on true stories. Can you speak a little bit about what it's like to kind of blend fact and fiction that way, and the research that went into it, and sort of the process of turning someone's life into a story?
Sure, you bet. I'm a fiction writer, right? And so my number one goal is to write a compelling story. And so, I think it's really cool when you can take a true life story, sort of inspired by story, and build a story around that. But I'm not really concerned about it being exactly correct. Now, if you're writing nonfiction, that's not the attitude you can have. You have to be exact. You have to footnote everything. You can't make stuff up, right? I get to make stuff up. I think the phrase is telling lies for fun and profit, right? And so really my focus is always on the story. But it's a beautiful thing when, like, say, for example, The Orphan Keeper. So this is Taj's story when he's kidnapped as a child in India, sold to an orphanage, brought to the United States. It was already an amazing story. I just had to worry about how to best write that story, what to leave out, what to include, what voice, etc. So I love writing stories like that, but I don't necessarily feel bound by the story. Here's a quick example in Taj's story. His mom early on would go see the astrologers because she was, it's a big thing in India, and she wanted to know what the astrologers had to say, whether her son was coming back. She had an astrologer tell her that your son will return to India, and when he does, he will fly. And she didn't know what fly meant because she thought, she's from a, dirt floor, thatched hut, poor family. She's like, people can't fly. I don't know what that means. Well, 8 months later, Taj flew back to India to find his family. Now that happened in real life years earlier when Taj was first taken. I couldn't include it in an exact timeline because we'd long left India. We're now with Taj in the United States. So that's an example of what I get to do as a fiction writer, where I can take real life, but I can adjust it. I wanted to include that because it was really cool, but I can change the timeline if that fits best into the story. And so, that's what I do. As far as research, really the most difficult book was the most recent, In Times of Rain and War. Set in World War II. And I thought, oh, World War II, yeah, that'll be fun. I had no clue, no idea the research that would go into that. 3 years later, I'm still following up on research because you can't mess up. You have to get it right. You'll get called out. There are enough, World War II buffs out there. And so yeah, to be able to write that took a tremendous amount of research. There again, so I'm writing about a bomb disposal team in London during the Blitz. do the things I write about, because it's inspired by a real person, Rachel Bauer's grandfather. He served in bomb disposal in World War II. Do the things I write about, did they actually happen to Rachel's grandfather? Well, no, not exactly. We don't know a lot about his experience, but I researched tons of bomb disposal teams, and everything I write about in that story did happen to a real bomb disposal team. So it's this interesting mix of facts and fiction. People will say, well, is it true? And how do you answer that? I mean, it's like, well, sort of, because it's not black and white. It's sort of this gray area. But again, that's what makes it interesting, and both for me as the writer, and I hope for the readers.
Okay, great. You mentioned little pearls of wisdom that you've taken and from other authors, and little like your favorite quotes and things like that. Who are some of the authors that you look up to the most?
Anthony Doerr, I mentioned, is so amazing with descriptions. He just really out of this world descriptions. So he's fabulous. If it's time to write descriptions, I'll read some Anthony Doerr. Let's see, I've forgotten his name. Let's see. Oh, Nick Hornby. Nick Hornby is amazing with dialogue, right? Nick Hornby wrote About a Boy, High Fidelity. I'm not as wild about his later work, but some of those early works I just think are fabulous. His dialogue is excellent. And so if I'm going to sit down and write dialogue, I'll whip out some Nick Hornby and then start and read it to sort of get in the groove, if you will. I think it's fun to go back and read writers like Mark Twain and writers from 100 years ago, or even with The Rent Collector. I mean, it's kind of this ode to literature, if you will. I'm kind of paying tribute to classical literature. And so you can, there's pieces in there from Aesop's fables, and they're written, over 1,000 years ago, and yet you can take it's wisdom that is just as applicable today as it was the day it was written. That's pretty cool, right? And so, yeah, those are a couple of authors that come to mind. So I'm quite inspired by.
How did your public relations background help you in your journey to being published? And what tips can you offer writers on sort of marketing themselves and networking and building relationships and things like that?
Yeah, great question. And there's kind of two sides to this question, and I'm just take what I say with a grain of salt, right? So I see writers who are on social media, and they are on social media. They've got to be on there for 2 or 3 hours a day because of what they post and how often they're responding, and they love talking about writing, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's great. But I look at that and I think, man, you should be spending that time writing. Like, don't talk about writing, write. Now, if being on social media talking about writing brings them joy, great, I'm all for it. I have no problem with it. But writers will say to me, I want to be published. What can I do to get published? And my reply is, get off social media. Focus on your story. Quit spending so much time, again, talking about it, and just start to do it. That said, there are writers that I can name who are huge on social media. They have thousands of followers. And when they published their first book, there's one, Jenny Lawson. So her book, when it debuted at #1 New York Times, right? Why? Well, because she already has thousands of followers, hundreds of thousands of followers. And so she says, hey, my book's out. They're all going to go buy it. And it shoots to #1 New York Times. She's a great writer. And so, she deserves it. But my whole point is she is using her social media in a PR kind of way, in a marketing kind of way. And that's a beautiful thing. I mean, that's amazing. But you just have to learn to sort of divide the two. And when you're writing, it's, again, like I said before, don't jump onto the marketing too soon. Make sure your book is amazing. And once it's amazing, then focus on, sort of the PR side. But a lot of writers, they focus on the writing, and then they say, I don't know how to do anything else. And they just turn it over to the publisher, and they hope that the publisher is going to do it. And you can't take that attitude. You have to go into it with the attitude of, the publisher's going to do nothing. I have to do everything. What else can I do to make this book successful? And that's after the book's written and it's in and it's done, right? But then you have to sort of get outside your comfort zone. And that's a good lesson on life. We ought to do that with everything, right? Get outside your comfort zone, do any and everything that you can to sort of make your book a success. And then if it is, great. And if it's not, that's great too, because you did everything you could do, right? And so that's kind of how I at least have tried to approach it and try and live my life. And for good or bad, that's what I've done.
Okay. What would you say is the most valuable piece of advice you received from another writer?
I had there's a woman named Amanda Dixon. She's actually a radio personality, and she told me, she said, passion finds a way. And I've touched on that because it's a big deal to me, but I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. You just have to be so passionate about the story that's inside you that you want to get out there. It's sort of like when I needed to write this story about this family who lived in a dump. That was very passion for me, right? That's what you need your story needs to be. I think Stephen King, he once said something, and I'll botch this quote, but it was something like, the emotion that's at the root of bad writing is fear. And I think there's some wisdom in that. We're sometimes a little bit scared of failing. I'll speak with authors and they'll say, yeah, I've written this manuscript. I don't really expect to get it published, and and that's fine. I mean, that's kind of what I just said, right? That's a good attitude to have, except that you can tell by the look in their eyes and the way they say it, they really would like to get the book published. And I would contend, if I say to them, hey, I think I could get this published for you, they would all of a sudden get really excited. And so it causes me to kind of analyze that and say, well, then why did you tell me that you don't want to get published if you really do? Because I'm not so sure that's healthy. Like, maybe it's okay to say, I really would like to get this book published. But if not, be okay with the result, right? And so kind of put yourself out there. Go out on a limb, if you will. Sometimes we're so timid and fearful, according to Stephen King, of failing, of making a mistake, that we tend to hold back and we tend to not really, put ourselves out there. And I think that can be a mistake. It can be to our detriment. Is it easy? No, it's extremely hard. And again, I'm not the perfect example of that, but I think there's something innately something to it.
Okay. What for you is the most difficult part, the most challenging part of the writing process, and how do you overcome that difficulty?
Yeah, it comes back to what I said, that the most difficult part is putting the words together. I mean, it's sitting down and having a thought and saying, okay, this is going to have, this family's in the dump, and this is what's going to happen to them. Well, the gangs are going to come in and steal the metal that they've saved. Okay, well, how am I going to write that? Or here's a better example. So with The Rent Collector, I started out writing that story in third person past tense, because that's how most stories are written, right? And okay, that's how I should probably do it. And it's almost like, as you get into know the characters will speak to you, as crazy as that sounds. And it was almost like Sang Lee was telling me, no, this needs to be first person. Okay, fine. I'll write it first person. So then I'm trying to write it first person past tense, because again, that's the more typical way that you would write the story. And again, it's like she's starting to scream to me as a character saying, no, this is going to be first person present tense. I want people to be with me real time in the dump as I'm here. And that's, of course, present tense. And I went back and forth 3 or 4 times until I finally got tired of her screaming at me, and I stuck with first person present tense. So again, I just think you have to, you stay in tune with the characters. You try and listen to the characters. You try and I don't write what Camron Wright wants to write. I want to write what Sang Lee is going to say and do and think. And so you really have to try and get into the head of those characters. And so that's sometimes difficult to do. That's a hard thing to do. I think with the World War II book, it was hard to do until I'd done enough research to begin to understand what it was like for those people living in London, being bombed day after day. And yeah, it takes a while to start to sort of grasp that. But once it comes, and once that happens, and once you innately understand those characters, yeah, it can be a beautiful thing.
All right. My last question is, what are you reading right now?
Right now I'm actually, this is a book that's been on my list it's been on my list forever. And because of the World War II book comes up, and so all the books that I want to read, they get pushed aside, and I have to read World War II books, and you get into tons of research. And so I have a long list of books that I want to read, and this has been on the top of the list. But Spark, if anybody's read that, and I've barely started it. You can see I'm just barely into it. I'm on page 7, right? So, but I've heard great things about it, and that's what I'm reading next. I try and read a wide variety of fiction, nonfiction, books on writing. About half the books that I read to this day are books about writing, just because, again, I find it so fascinating and interesting. So, oh, and again, I mentioned this earlier, Roy Williams books. There's 4 different books. Secret Formula of the Wizard of Ads, amazing book on writing. If you read it that way, you can actually download this for free from Roy Williams' website. If you go look for that, he's got the PDFs up there, and highly recommended.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have for this evening. Cameron, thank you so much for joining us and giving us your perspective and your advice about writing. If anyone is interested in checking out one of Cameron's books, we do have several of them available right now in print and in ebook form from the Metropolitan Library System. And you can go to metrolibrary.org and see what's available. And if you want to see what else is available for LitFest Online this year, go to metrolibrary.org/LitFest for a full list of our programs and presentations. That's all the time we have for this evening. Thank you so much for joining me, and have a good night.